get started because we are trying to keep on track. I don't know how well that will go for the rest of the afternoon, but welcome to the first Santa Clarita Valley Book Festival at College of the Canyons. This panel is going to put both of those elements together because we have members of the College of the Canyons faculty here, and I've got some questions. I don't know how they're going to go with my questions because they're not used to being the on the receiving end of the questions. So maybe we'll start with introductions and then see how my questions go for them. I'm Ruth Rassool, by the way. I teach English here. One of my students is here right now. You don't have an assignment due, do you? Have you done your work?
Tomorrow we do.
Okay. Good, so you can stay. Okay, let's start with Fred.
Awesome. Well, thank you for having me here, Ruth. My name is Fred Bobola. I was a student here 20 years ago now. With Ruth, we were classmates. We met in Shakespeare class.
Yep.
And we went to UCLA together. I came back here in 2016 or 2018 to start working again here in higher ed after switching careers. And I really enjoy writing fantasy, sci-fi as well. Mainly novels, a little bit of screenplay here and there, but mainly novels is what I like to do. So.
And Sarah?
I'm Sarah Burns, and I'm an historian. I've been teaching history for 29 years, first at Bakersfield College, then Cal State Bakersfield, then College of the Canyons, intending to move here, and then I met someone and stayed there. And so I commuted for a long time and was hired for Antelope Valley College as well to teach African American and women's history. So that's my historic background. I love writing historical fiction as well. So this is my third historical fiction, and it is based on the town that I've been stuck in for a long time, which is Bakersfield, California. I jokingly, in the intro to the book, explain that I've been trying to escape, and there's something, either a job or a person, that keeps me there. But I'm going to get out, but I figured if I'm there for decades, I've got a lot of flaming stories to tell, and Cooksville is a really hot book. So I'll pass that on.
Hi, I'm Chase Dimock, and I'm also a professor of English here at College of the Canyons. Just finished my 7th year, so fully tenured at this point. And as of this week, also the director of the Campus Honors Program. And I'm also a creative writer myself, mostly poetry. My first book of poetry came out a couple of years ago. It's called Sentinel Species, and it's about our relationships with animals and the environment. I'm also a publisher. I'm the managing editor of an online literary magazine called As It Ought to Be, asitoughtobe.magazine.com. And we publish poetry, nonfiction, interviews, and book reviews. So I've got experience kind of on both sides of the glass, both as a writer and also as a publisher.
Hi, my name is Mellisa Demirel. I used to be a CUC student here. I graduated from College of the Canyons back in 2018. Then I went on to get my bachelor's and master's degrees in creative writing from CSUN. And CSUN is where I currently work as the writing consultant and instructional assistant for the accounting department in the College of Business and Economics. And so I like to write in a little bit of everything, but right now I have my satirical horror rom-com out. So if you guys are interested in things like Dexter, or there's that show on Netflix called You, if you're into those things, and paranormal, you might enjoy my novel, Bloodwork, which just came out in February.
That's wonderful. Okay. Let's stay with Mellisa at that end. Can you say something, Mellisa, about your process as an author?
So typically I do outline, but the outline is sort of all over the place. It's kind of a messy outline, and so I know what happens from beginning to the middle to the end. But of course, that always ends up changing, right? The characters kind of take you elsewhere. And so I just sort of, I guess I do a mixture of outlining and going with the flow when it comes to my process.
Chase, what about you?
Poetry is a bit of a different beast, of course, than writing like a full novel. So it can come to you piecemeal. The most important thing for me is kind of thinking like a poet. And that as I'm just going through my daily life, like driving in the car and listening to NPR, and there might be an interesting story, or for my book, if I hear a cool animal fact, I'll think, what does that make me feel? What does that make me think? How does that make me reimagine the world around me? And can I craft a poem out of that? And the thing I like about poetry is that, if you have, it only takes 60 seconds to read most poems, right? It takes a lifetime to understand it, but only 60 seconds to read. And also as a writer, it's great because you can have so many different drafts of poems that are half written or just even lines or images. And you can keep coming back to different poems as you're feeling inspired or as the pieces start coming to you. So I like to have like many different pages open of different topics, different poems in process. And then sometimes they get transfusions from one another. One line over here goes into another, or like a succulent, a piece of a poem breaks off and creates its own poem later on. And then eventually, as I realized for my first book that I was writing a lot about animals and a lot about the environment. And so I started shaping a book around my personal relationships with animals, but also our cultural and collective relationship as well.
I like that image of the succulent which you got there.
And there are poems about succulents in my
I'm
book.
not a poet, but I'm inspired by that now. So,
Well, my process really has to do with my concentration in, I was a double major, English and history. I went on to get my master's in history. And I have a passion for solving social problems. And so that's what sticks in my mind when I start to compose a work of fiction. The first book that I did focus on women's roles and African American history as far as moving from indentured servitude to pure slavery. And so that book was very colonial America and the mess that was created in Virginia on the first plantations. So I don't do the outline. I have the history and the timeline in my mind. So I jump in and I start. Now with that book back in 2000 to 2003, I had books all over the floor and I'm crawling around doing research and making sure that I get it all exact, a little background, and then jump into the fiction. Today, when I wrote a few years ago, began Cooksville, USA, it was all at my fingertips. It's absolutely beautiful. I can be composing, and I really truly believe in that, the angel on the shoulder, an author's intuition. I'll be writing and I'll think, perhaps this person was in Las Vegas at this time, and I just Google it, and sure enough, not only was he there, he was helping to build that hotel when Bugsy Siegel bought it. He was supervising. It was Del Webb. I thought, Del Webb could have been traveling through there. So I think about it. I think about the timeline. He could have been. Well, no, he was. It was just really wonderful. So when you have the history background and you have the history in your mind, today you can go to the sources right away, and it made it just terrific. So I don't use the outline. I create as I go, and I go leave it cold for a few days, come back, and I'll say, why did I say it that way? You have to write and rewrite, don't you, Ruth? You just do. And that's the beauty of it. Then you say, oh, man, I nailed that. And it's a lot of fun. That's my process.
Fred, I'll let you go because they're making me think of things, but you go next.
Well, I mean, tough acts to follow. You made me go last. You couldn't have me go first.
You get them first next time.
Quite organized. I guess for me personally, my writing process has always been a little bit chaotic. I describe myself as an inside-out kind of writer. So what that means is essentially when I experience something, whether I read it, whether I watch it, whether it's through visual media or something happened in my life, I just write down that emotional experience that I had, like what inspired me to feel this great spontaneous overflow of emotion, to use a Wordsworth quote. And I try to capture that, and I try to think of ways to kind of remix that into the genres that I write in, which mainly are fantasy and sci-fi. I do think, as someone who would not consider himself a poet, I used to write a lot of poetry. I did study a lot of poetry. I do try to stay kind of in that vein where I really focus more on the emotion, and then I kind of flesh out and develop the the setting, the dialogue, the plot, the things that kind of the exposition that move the story along. But for me, it's always focusing around a central idea or theme that I want the reader to experience that I kind of experience myself. So it gets you in a lot of trouble because you have these grand ideas and you write them down, and then next thing you know, you're trying to figure out how's that going to connect back to something that you said earlier with this character and that character, and it jumps all over the place. But it's a lot of fun. It's quite chaotic. It's my process. I probably wouldn't recommend it unless you're like me and you're a scatterbrain. Then it kind of might work for you. But yeah, and outlining is definitely something you probably should try to do. But also, and I think the rest of the panel can attest to this, a lot of it kind of changes as you go. As you mentioned, the editing process is multiple layers. And so I would say don't worry or be frustrated or concerned if you feel like you're writing things that might not connect or make sense, because you never know how the final product's going to kind of finish. So just never delete anything. Always move it over to another document and another document, and then you'll be like me and you'll have, she's laughing because she knows 600 pages of stuff that you'll never use. But that's fine. That's part of the process, is creating that bank of knowledge and stories, and your story will kind of reveal itself. So.
And I think you have used them. If you've got 600 pages, you say you won't use them. You've used them in creating those 600 pages. There's the use.
Well, exactly. Yeah, I couldn't have gotten to the point I am now if I didn't go through those. If I didn't go through those steps, just like I'm sure an artist who has the talent to create images, maybe there's multiple renditions of that, or maybe not. Maybe there's more talent than I am. They just shoot it out the first time. I don't know.
I don't think there's any writer in this room or anywhere else that just shoots it out the first time.
Yeah.
But as you were answering, it made me think: is your process genre specific? Like, because you're writing historical fiction, non-fiction, does that make it more ordered, or is it you as an author that makes it more authored? Or does poetry have more of a free form to it, and does writing fantasy have that kind of chaotic element to it? I don't know if it's author or genre led. What do you think?
I think that, when it comes to fantasy, I am working on a fantasy right now, and I just finished writing horror, so there is a big difference there. For fantasy, I do have to plan more. The magic elements and all this stuff, I have to have it laid out so that I can, trust that I know what I'm doing, because fantasy is sort of a bigger genre. It's a little bit more complicated. I mean, just look at Game of Thrones, right? There's a lot of pieces moving. And so for fantasy, more outlining, more preparation, more detailed sort of bullet points on, again, what the magic system looks like, what the world looks like. But for horror, that was more sort of character-led. So I was a little bit more spontaneous with my horror novel. But I can't be that spontaneous with my fantasy that I'm currently working on.
The thing I like about poetry the most is that I have a limited attention span sometimes. And sometimes I feel like writing for 10 minutes. Sometimes I feel like writing for the entire evening. And sometimes I go weeks or months without writing. What I like about poetry is that it's able to, in its brevity, it's able to capture something very quickly in a moment, And I feel like you can get away with spending just a few minutes dabbling, as much inspiration as you have, as much feeling as you have, as much as you're into it. And then when that escapes you, you can either move on to another poem like I do, or just, close your laptop. I always write. I can't write physically. I have to do it on a laptop. I think it's because if I write something down, like a line that I don't like, or an approach that I thought, that's not the right way to go, I can delete it from existence entirely. There's no physical, I don't have to scratch it out or erase it or anything like that. I can pretend like it didn't exist. And so what I like about that, and I'm thinking more and more about process, is that one of the great things about any art that you do, whether it's literary, visual, music, whatever, is I think you have to love the process of making, and not be thinking of a final product, but be loving just the experience of it. So for however long in that moment at that time, working on a poem or editing a poem or just playing around with language in generative ways, as long as that's enjoyable and challenging and interesting and engaging for me, I go on with it. But as soon as that leaves me, luckily I've got, this amazing job at College of the Canyons and don't have to write poetry to pay the bills. I can stop and just make it a process-oriented thing. And when it's finished, whether it's a day, a month, or I was even looking at some published work in my book just now, and I'm like, man, I wish I had changed the punctuation here, or I wish I hadn't jammed that line, but it's in the book and it's too late. But still, I'll go back to my Microsoft Word and change it there, even though I can't change it in a paper book.
You're grading your own work.
Exactly. I mean, I've read about poets that do that will edit poems that have already been published. Yeah. I think I said earlier that part of my process of writing is inhabiting the mindset of poetry, seeing the world through poetry, feeling in poetry. And so when I watch something on TV or listen to something on NPR, feeling like there's a poem there. During the semester, I don't write as much because I'm more thinking like a teacher. And so I hear something on NPR and I think, oh, that fits so good in this class that I'm doing, or I watch something on TV and I'm like, oh, that illustrates a point. I can use a clip from that. So it's many different hats to wear. But I teach a lot of poetry in terms of analysis and reading poems. And one of the things that I want to take as a poet, thinking about how do I want my own work read and understood. And what I realize as a writer, while I do have specific ideas and expressions and thoughts and opinions and perspectives, at the same time, I really am more interested in making a human connection. That whatever somebody gets out of my poem, it doesn't have to be agreeing with my perspective or my opinion, but just that there was a connection, or that anything I wrote made them think, feel, reflect, just see themselves or the world or any subject in any kind of a different or expanded or enriched way. That's the goal for me. And so when I teach poetry to my students, what I want them to do is to kind of step back from all the things in their education that made them hate poetry. I've already gotten, by the way, at my table, many people that are like, ooh, poetry, I always hated poetry. And I'm like, it's because in high school, it's just taught so badly because it's taught for standardized tests. And so it's taught as if it's a riddle that needs to be solved and that there's a correct answer. And your teacher always tells you did it wrong. You should have picked C when the answer, and you picked B. And the fact of the matter is I tell my students, don't start with analysis, interpretation, because a poet is not a riddle to be solved. It is something to engage with. Start with your feelings. Start with what makes impressions on you, because that is what poetry is ultimately supposed to do. Then go more in depth and think about multiple perspectives. Think about your subjectivity versus what the author is experiencing. But ultimately, I teach how I want to be read, and that's I want you to make my poem your poem. It's not about what I want to. I don't want to drill into your minds, and be pedantic about it. But instead, I want you to make your own meaning out of it. And so I teach my students to do that with classic poems that we study in my classes.
Sarah?
Okay. Well, the field of history is pretty clearly factual, right? But that's why I enjoy that escape into fictionalized history, because the reason I'm passionate about history is I can see the problems along the timelines, the cause, the effect, and what we should have done instead of what we did do, and that sort of thing. I'm a social historian. That's why I focused on women's and African American history, to try to look at the problems and be a problem solver. Within those areas, though, I like the whole backdrop of history, so you can see what everybody's thinking and everybody's doing. So the fictional people enable me to be more creative, but to have the truth going on in the background. I don't change the 50s or the 60s or the 70s or the 80s. That's what really happened.
Wait, 80s is history now?
Huh?
80s is history now?
I'm sorry.
Okay.
Anyway, so my creative process, I'm saying, differs from someone who's teaching English or communications or poetry. but it is still a creative process, and it's for solving problems.
Mm-hmm.
But when it comes to Cooksville, it's because I've been entrenched with all these people, playing tennis with them and being in the Chamber of Commerce, selling real estate, and then getting back to my passion of history and knowing what goes on behind the scenes and going, wow. And so, I had to fictionalize them to protect everyone. Yeah, that's Cooksville is Bakersfield, if you're wondering.
Oh, I've just got it. Cooks and
Yeah.
bakers.
Me too, just now.
Bakersfield was founded by Colonel Baker in 1850, so Cooksville was founded by Frank Cook in 1850. After he had fought in the Mexican War and came to the gold fields, and I take it all the way into the 21st century. Yeah, so it's interesting. It's a Peyton place. Let me say
Okay.
that.
Yeah.
It has borders, and everybody knows what's going on.
So Fred, I think you started to answer this already, but how does your writing inform your teaching, or as Mellisa said, vice versa? How does your teaching inform your writing?
Well, I don't know. It's interesting because when I was doing my journey through undergrad, I wanted to be a creative writing major. And at the Ford University that I went to, you had to kind of audition and trial, and I got rejected both times. And because I was submitting a chapter from a 60 chapter epic fantasy novel,
Yeah.
and they're looking for short story, poetry, memoir, nonfiction. So that really kind of bummed me out. I actually quit writing for a few years after undergrad. I thought, well, if I can't even get into this program, how am I going to ever be a writer? And a few years later, kind of thinking and reflecting about it, I was like, you know what? I took 3 classes that were the study of the novel, just different eras. And so we had to do a book a week, 10-week quarters, so 30 books that I read. And I think maybe 2 or 3 people had an MFA out of all those authors, and all the rest were just like normal people. And so I was like, okay, maybe I can kind of do this. So I guess to answer the question, I try to encourage people to just kind of like write about what they know versus like, is this good? Is this the right way? Obviously, if you're trying to write for publication and commercialization, yes, you do need to write in what's hot and what's in. That certainly is a thing. But if you're writing to express your inner emotions, if you're writing to accomplish something for yourself, that's a whole different story. And I guess maybe that's a whole other tangent, is that you have to write for different reasons, and you have to know the reason why you write. And if you're writing to be commercially successful and you want to be on HBO Max and Netflix, and you want to have a yacht, you're probably going to have to make a lot of artistic sacrifices along the way. If you want to write the thing that is most passionate to you, that's a representation of your existence and your soul as a existing being in this universe, then maybe not a lot of people are going to like it or want to buy it. And that you have to be okay with that. You have to draw those kind of lines. And so I guess to answer the question, it's important to first understand, like, why are you writing? So for example, English 101 that we teach here, it's the first thing I say in the first day of class. I go, listen, I know most of you, maybe all of you, are only here because you have to be here. This is a general ed class. You just want to take this and get it out of the way. And I'm okay with that. Like, let's throw that out in the room. It's okay if you feel that way. And so their engagement with writing is much different than someone who, say, is an English major. It's like, oh, this is my thing. This is what I want to do. I want to study literature. I'm going to write these novels and these poetry collections and these historical fictions and these romance, horror, books. That's kind of a different approach. So I guess based on what the person's intentions for writing are, would reflect the way you kind of go about approaching that.
And Mellisa used to be my student
Yes.
many years ago.
Yes.
And she's reminded me when she's flipped my question around, as students tend to do. It reminded me of another student. I was teaching Intro to Lit. And we were reading Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. And I can't remember what the prompt was, because I think it comes down, a lot of this comes down to writing effective prompts. I don't know if I did, but the student researched postpartum depression and said that Dr. Frankenstein was suffering from postpartum depression, because there's enough in the book he once his creature comes to life, he rejects him, just like you might reject a child, and he isolates himself from his family and friends, and he takes to his bed, and he has fevers. And the student had compared what was in the novel to postpartum depression, which Mary Shelley wouldn't have known anything about. Well, she would have known about it, but it hadn't been researched. So nobody else in the room had ever thought of that, and that's been going on. I've been telling that story for years now. That students always teach you something as well. Mm-hmm. I'm going to put you guys on the spot now a little bit because, and Sarah, you've been sharing this a little bit, but is there something that you want to talk about your writing specifically? Is there a particular piece of your writing either that you want to share, or just tell us a bit more about it before we go buy the book?
Should I go first again? Sure. Okay. Well, I got published with a small traditional publisher, and I found during my writing process for that the book that I had written was sort of a mix of commercial but also artsy. To me, it feels very like A24, I guess you could say. And what I'm realizing writing now while I'm hunting for a literary agent is that I really have to make a lot of artistic sacrifices, as we've discussed. I have to sort of make my writing a bit more accessible and write in, as Fred said, what's hot, what's new. Right now, romantasy is big, so I'm trying to write as much as romantasy as I possibly can. And so, yeah, that's just something that that I've got going on right now.
Any specifics about your book that you have with you here today?
Something specific about it, I guess, is it was pitched as a serial killer who is like a wannabe Dexter, but is actually more like Joe Goldberg from You, partners up with a vampire nurse.
Okay.
So
now you know.
a little interesting. It's a satirical horror rom-com, so it's got a lot going on. I wrote it after a terrible heartbreak, and really the whole thing is about the danger of obsessing over the person that you think is, the one for you, and it has to do with infatuation. And I think by the end of the book, that's when you realize, like, oh, this is a satire, because most romances have a happy ending. I would argue that mine is a little bit open to interpretation. It's a happy ending, but it's also a tragic ending, because we got these two love interests who are, they're terrible human beings. I mean, one is a vampire and one is a serial killer, and so they are just imperfectly perfect for each other. And so I feel like I ended it the only way that I could. It's a #1 Amazon bestseller, and it was a #1 new release under Amazon's vampire horror and horror comedy categories. So I think I did something right, while attempting that sort of more, indie author journey. And so, yeah, it's a lot of fun. I don't think I would really change anything about it. It is the way it is for a reason, as most satires are. So, yeah.
Yeah, so my book of poetry, Sentinel Species, is about our relationships with animals and the environment, both my personal relationships. So there's some poems about my dog. My first section begins and ends with poems about my dog, Kiana. She's now 17 years old. She was my teaching assistant for all my classes, but she's retired, and my puppy Dodger is now my teaching assistant. And I've started writing some poems about him as well. Writing about a puppy is a bit different than writing about an elderly dog. And so the title of the book, Sentinel Species, refers specifically to a phenomenon of animals who behave in a certain way in an environment that tells us something perhaps invisible to humans is going on. So the most famous example of a sentinel species, which is what's on the cover of my book, is the canary. That canaries were used by coal miners way back in the day to detect essentially carbon monoxide leaks, because carbon monoxide, as we know, is odorless. And so before you know there's a leak, you've essentially asphyxiated. So back in the day, they would bring a canary down with them, and if the canary flopped over dead, you knew it was time to leave. So that's one example of a sentinel species, and there is a poem about canaries in there and I imagine because they got fired in the 1980s and were replaced by electronic machines that could much better detect these leaks. So I thought about, what did all these unemployed canaries do after they lost their mining jobs? And in the last couple of decades, the miners lost their jobs too. And so there's some traditional sentinel species written about in there. But I like to think about in general, what do animals teach us about our environment, about us, and about our society, and about who we are, if we paid more attention to them and understood what they are, and not necessarily the metaphors or uses or, sadly, exploitation of animals that we commonly have in our society? What can we learn if we understood them for what they are instead of what we make them into?
Just imagining a canary turning out his little light on his helmet.
Sadly flying home. Yeah.
I'm
I
done
don't have
now.
the die to
Got to
do it.
diversify. Maybe go back to the community college,
Yeah.
learn a new trade.
Yeah, doing solar tech or something. Sarah,
Okay.
any more to add?
Yeah, I think probably Larry would agree with me on this. He's producing my Audible for Amazon.
Oh, cool.
But that the fact that I knew most of the people in my book, and that's really why I had to fictionalize their names, and sometimes I had to put them in a different decade. But the leading character in my book, he's, God rest his dirty soul, he was an interesting investigator, a true gumshoe. I mean, he did it all. He did go to Vegas. He was a G-man for the IRS. But I knew him personally. My husband knew him personally when he was a criminal law attorney, and he was the fixer. And everybody, when I met Steve, I found out everybody in town knew Leonard Winters. He wouldn't mind me saying it, would you, Winter? You are. And I turned him into Lyndon Weathers. I could remember, it has something to do with the weather. Okay, Lyndon Weathers, and he's going to be Lenny. And he really did investigate the most salacious, horrible crimes in Bakersfield. And we talk about it over lunch, going out to Basque food, and I've got to tell your story. Oh, he said, 50 cents and a cup of coffee, that's about all it's good for. But as you know, it's good for a whole lot. And his character in my book passes away in 2011 too, having had such an exciting life, but never permanently hooking up with anybody. He met a lot of women, and at his service, his funeral service, I sat there and listened to them stand up there and say, he had Hollywood good looks. Did he say anything about me? And they're wanting to know, to the people who were having the memorial service, because he was a ladies' man, and he was covering up bloody crimes like Spade Cooley, who was a country western singer. And he, on the desert, he was a Roy Rogers lookalike, sang with Roy, was on his show, and on the desert killed his wife brutally because he suspected she was having an affair with Roy Rogers. And Leonard went over, and he was a cleanup man. That was back in the day, 61. Wiped up the blood, rolled up the carpet, said, give me the bloody boots, and he kept them until the day he died. And my husband wanted him. And Dennis Quaid wanted him. He wanted to tell his story, and that's when I knew this is going to be a good story, because he went to prison. He didn't get life, and he didn't get the death penalty, and he was going to be paroled out of prison. First day out, Spade Cooley goes out and performs and has a heart attack, and after 3 or 4 years in prison. So the stories in this book, they're true. He's Ace Gentry in my book, and I changed his wife's name, and so they're real stories. And to sit and listen to him, I'm remembering them interviewing one woman that had probably killed her husband because her father was a mobster, and he loaned money to him to start his restaurant, and he wasn't making enough to pay Papa back, and you don't mess with the mob. So when Leonard and his attorney went to the prison to interview her, she told him some cock and bull story, I will call it. And the attorney said, Leonard, I smell gas. Do you? And he said, yes, I do. And they got up and walked out. Well, the next day she talked to Papa and called him back. She had a totally different story and $10,000. And they took her case.
A lesson learned.
Yeah. That's just a little insight. Sorry.
Well, we're out of time, but you can find these authors at their tables and get any more murders and things in Bakersfield, or the other topics that we've talked about. Maybe one quick question, if I haven't covered something that you were itching to ask. Yes.
Any thoughts on writing for different mediums, not just novels of poetry, but you mentioned screenplays, maybe even TV shows, games, even just different mediums. Any thoughts?
So for screenwriting, which I also dabble in, I mean, a screenplay is typically, for a feature film, it's about 100 pages long or so. So I think that is way easier. For me, that's a bit of a breeze because you've just got the dialogue and the action, and you're not really in the characters' heads as much. I mean, you're working with a whole team of people, right? So let's say the cinematographer is going to do a wonderful job capturing the internalized feelings of the characters on the screen. So I think it's a quicker process, but I'm a bit stubborn because I love novels so much. So I love, taking my time, really like stretching things out, going over every little detail. I love having that kind of power with novels. Whereas with screenplays, you only get so much because, again, the other people on board, the cast, the crew, they're going to be doing everything they can to make sure that your vision is shared and final. So, yeah.
There are some kind of shortcuts, aren't there? Because you're in a visual medium, so you don't have to have that lengthy description. You just show them the mountain or whatever it might be.
Yeah.
We're running out of time. I don't know if...
Just a quick follow-up. If
Yeah.
you want to talk about video game writing, let me know. We can chat outside. So I taught a lecture a few times on how to world build with the genre that you're writing in kind of in mind. I'm assuming this is for indie or something that you want to produce yourself with some friends or...
Me personally, yeah, we'll talk outside, but just as a panel, what's your knowledge on different mediums? Not necessarily what teams are doing, but what you're doing in different mediums.
Got it. Okay, cool. Well, happy to chat with you outside. I don't want to hold everybody up. So
Yeah. Oh, one thing. I'm actually in the process of writing a pilot for a show with my partner, who's a producer. And one thing I'll recommend is we've been studying the Duffer Brothers, who wrote Stranger Things, did a masterclass on screenwriting, and we're just using that as our Bible for sketching this out. And I think of so look up that on masterclass. They do amazing stuff. And then I think of the quote from Carl Sagan: in order to bake an apple pie, you must first create the universe. And that's exactly it. You have to create the universe before you can actually write a single word of dialogue or exposition in a screenplay. So you create the universe, then you create the apple pie.
Well, thank you, faculty.